November 14th, 1976, Las Vegas, Nevada. The city was doing what it always did at night. The lights were on, the casinos were full, and thousands of people were moving through the streets looking for something to remember. Las Vegas in the 1970s was a place where anything could happen, and people came from all over the country knowing that. But on this particular night, most of them were headed to one place, the Las Vegas Hilton. The hotel had become something of a second home for Elvis Presley over the years. He had performed there more times than most people could count, and the relationship between Elvis and Las Vegas had grown into something that went beyond just a performance schedule. The city knew him, the staff knew him, the audiences that filled those seats night after night knew what they were coming to see, and they came anyway, every single time. By 1976, Elvis had been performing professionally for more than 2 decades. He had started as a young man from Memphis who made a sound nobody had heard before, and he had grown into one of the most recognized names on the planet. There were very few places on Earth where people did not know who Elvis Presley was. And on the nights when he performed in Las Vegas, that fact was impossible to ignore. The Las Vegas Hilton showroom could hold thousands of people. On November 14th, it was full. Every seat was taken. People had planned for this night, bought their tickets, made arrangements, and shown up ready. The room had that particular energy that only comes when a large crowd is waiting for something they genuinely want to see. Not polite anticipation, real excitement. The staff at the Hilton had done this many times before. The setup was familiar to everyone who worked there. The stage was ready, the lighting was in place, and the band had already run through what they needed to run through. Elvis's shows were not casual or loosely organized. There was a structure to them, a way things were supposed to go. And the people around him made sure that structure was in place before he ever walked out. Elvis had a band and a group of people who traveled with him and worked alongside him during his Las Vegas runs. They knew the set list, they knew the timing, and they knew how to read the room. A show at the Las Vegas Hilton in 1976 was a professional operation from the first note to the last, and everyone involved took that seriously. When Elvis walked onto that stage on November 14th, 1976, the crowd responded the way crowds always responded to him. There was noise, real noise, the kind that fills a room completely and leaves no space for anything else. People stood, people cheered. After all these years, after everything that had been written about him and said about him, the reaction was still the same. He still had that effect on people. He opened the show and moved into the performance. The band played behind him, the pacing was familiar, and the audience settled into the experience. This was what they had come for. Elvis performing in Las Vegas was something specific. It was not just a concert in the way that word is sometimes used. It was a show, a full experience, and the people in that room were getting exactly what they had expected. The set list moved along, song after song. Elvis talked to the crowd between numbers the way he always did, relaxed and direct, making the room feel smaller than it was. He had a way of making a venue full of thousands of people feel like something more personal, and the audiences in Las Vegas responded to that every time. For most of that evening, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. The show was running the way it was planned. The crowd was engaged. The band was tight. Elvis was in control of the room the way he usually was when he performed, which was completely. Nobody in that arena on November 14th, 1976 had any reason to expect what was about to happen. The night had started as a normal Las Vegas performance, the kind Elvis had done hundreds of times, the kind the audience had seen before and come back to see again. Everything about it felt familiar and settled and exactly right. But somewhere in that crowd of thousands, a man named Big Mike was sitting with too much alcohol in his system and something building inside him that was about to change the direction of the entire night. Nobody knew that yet. Not Elvis, not the band, not the 20,000 people sitting in that room. The show was still going exactly as planned. The show was moving along exactly as it was supposed to. Elvis was working through the set list, the band was in rhythm behind him, and the crowd was doing what Las Vegas crowds did during an Elvis performance. They were watching, they were listening, and they were fully inside the experience. The energy in the room was steady and warm, the kind that builds slowly over the course of a show and makes everyone in the seat feel like they are part of something. That is how it felt for most of the night. Then something changed. It did not happen all at once. It started as a disturbance somewhere in the middle of the crowd. A voice, not singing along, not cheering, but something else. Something that did not fit the sound of the room. People sitting nearby turned their heads. A few rows reacted first, then the ripple moved outward, and within a few moments a section of that audience had shifted its attention away from the stage. A man had stood up. His name was Big Mike. That was what people called him, and the name fit. He was a large man, physically noticeable even in a packed room, and on this night he was drunk. Not slightly drunk. Not the kind of drunk that makes a person louder than usual and a little unsteady. He was deeply intoxicated, and whatever was going on inside him had reached the point where it was coming out whether he intended it to or not. He was not there to enjoy the show anymore. Something had shifted in him during the evening, and by the time he stood up, he was past the point of sitting quietly and watching like everyone else around him. He wanted to say something. He wanted to be heard. And he made sure he was. Big Mike started shouting. His voice carried across that section of the arena, loud enough to cut through the music, loud enough for the people around him to hear exactly what he was saying. He was directing his words at the stage, at Elvis. He was shouting insults, the kind that are meant to humiliate, the kind that are designed to get a reaction. He was challenging Elvis, telling him to prove something, questioning him in front of an arena full of people who had come to see Elvis perform. The words he used were not subtle. He called Elvis out directly. He used language that made the people sitting near him uncomfortable. Some of them moved away slightly. Others just stared. A few tried to quiet him down, the way people do when someone near them is causing a scene in a public place. But Big Mike was not interested in being quieted. He kept going. The challenge he issued was personal. He told Elvis he was not a real man. He said it loudly, in a room full of thousands of people, pointed directly at the stage where Elvis was standing. This is the kind of moment that changes the atmosphere of a room instantly. 20,000 people became aware of what was happening, some of them quickly and some of them gradually, but the awareness spread through that arena the way awareness does when something unexpected breaks into the middle of a planned event. Conversation stopped. People who had been focused on the stage were now looking toward the disturbance. The energy in the room, which had been warm and settled just minutes before, shifted into something tense and uncertain. The security team at the Las Vegas Hilton was experienced. They had worked large events many times, and they knew how to handle situations like this. A drunk and disruptive audience member was not something they had never seen before. The protocol was clear and straightforward. You move in, you remove the person, you do it quickly and with as little additional disruption as possible, and the show continues. That is how it was handled in nearly every case. They were ready to do exactly that, but they needed the signal, and the signal had to come from Elvis. That was how it worked. The security team did not move on their own in a situation like this. They watched the stage. They waited for Elvis to give them some indication of what he wanted done. A look, a gesture, a nod toward the disturbance, anything that told them to go in and handle it. They waited. Elvis had seen what was happening. He was on that stage in front of all those people, and he was aware of Big Mike. He could hear him. He knew exactly what was being said and who was saying it. The security team kept waiting for the signal. The signal never came, and that fact alone changed everything about what was happening in that arena. Security was in position, they knew where Big Mike was standing, they had a clear path, and they were ready to move the moment Elvis gave them any indication that he wanted this handled the usual way. One look from the stage would have been enough. One small gesture and the situation would have been resolved in under a minute. Big Mike would have been escorted out, the disruption would have ended, and the show would have continued exactly as planned. But Elvis did not give that signal. He stood on that stage and he looked at the situation, and he made a decision in those first few seconds that nobody in that room was expecting. He did not nod toward security, he did not wave them in, he did not turn away from Big Mike and continue the show as if nothing was happening. He did not do any of the things that would have been completely normal and completely reasonable for a performer in his position to do. He just stood there, watching, thinking, and the crowd felt it. 20,000 people were now locked into this moment in a way that had nothing to do with the music or the set list or anything that had been planned for that evening. The show had stopped being the main event. What was happening between Elvis and this man in the crowd had taken over the room completely, and everyone in that arena was aware of it. The tension that settled over the Las Vegas Hilton in those moments was a specific kind of tension. It was not the tension of danger exactly, though there was an element of that. It was more the tension of uncertainty. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. In a room full of 20,000 people, that kind of uncertainty is a powerful thing. It makes the air feel different. It makes people sit straighter in their seats. It makes everyone go quiet without anyone telling them to. And that room went quiet. Not completely silent, because rooms that size never go completely silent, but the noise level dropped in a way that was noticeable and sudden. People who had been talking to the person next to them stopped talking. People who had been shifting in their seats or looking around went still. The attention of that entire arena narrowed down to 2 points: the stage where Elvis was standing and a spot in the crowd where Big Mike was. People near Big Mike had already created some distance. When someone is drunk and shouting in a public place, the natural instinct of the people around them is to move away slightly, to create a small buffer between themselves and the disturbance. That had already happened. There was a small open space around Big Mike now, which made him more visible, more exposed in the middle of that crowd. He was still standing. He had not sat down and he had not been removed. He was still there, still loud, still directing his words at the stage. And Elvis was still not signaling security. The people in that room were processing this in real time, and what they were processing did not match anything they had expected from the evening. Most of them had been to concerts before. Most of them understood, at least in a general way, how these situations were supposed to be handled. A disruptive audience member gets removed. That is the standard response. That is what happens in nearly every venue at nearly every show, when someone in the crowd crosses the line between being a difficult audience member and becoming a genuine disruption. The fact that this was not happening was registering with people. Some of them were confused, some of them were uncomfortable, some of them were watching the security team, noticing that they were positioned but not moving, and trying to understand what that meant. A few people closer to the disturbance were genuinely unsettled, because a large drunk man shouting in a crowded arena is not a situation that feels entirely safe to the people standing nearby. But most of the crowd was doing something else entirely. They were watching Elvis, because Elvis was the one who was going to determine what happened next, and everyone in that room understood that. His response to this moment, whatever it turned out to be, was going to shape everything that followed. The crowd was reading him, trying to figure out from his posture and his expression and his stillness what he was thinking and what he was about to do. His face was calm. Not the calm of someone who has not noticed what is happening, not the calm of someone who is ignoring the situation or waiting for it to resolve itself. It was a different kind of calm, the kind that comes from a person who has already made a decision and is simply moving towards it. The crowd could see that something was coming. They just had no idea what it was. Elvis moved. Not away from the situation. Not toward the side of the stage where he could put more distance between himself and the disruption. He moved forward, toward the edge of the stage, toward the crowd, toward the section of the arena where Big Mike was still standing, still loud, still directing everything he had at the man on that stage. That single movement changed the energy of the entire room. When a performer moves toward a disturbance instead of away from it, it is not something an audience is prepared for. Every instinct in a situation like that points in the other direction. You protect yourself. You create distance. You let the people whose job it is to handle these things handle them. That is the logical response. And that is the response that almost every performer in that position would have chosen without thinking twice about it. Elvis did not choose it. He walked to the edge of that stage deliberately, without rushing, without any visible sign of anger or agitation on his face. The calm that the crowd had noticed in him during those 10 seconds before was still there. He was not performing calm for the audience. He was not putting on a composed expression for the sake of appearances. He genuinely appeared settled in himself, clear about what he was doing and why he was doing it. The crowd reacted to that movement immediately. The noise level, which had already dropped significantly during the tense moments before, dropped further. People who had been watching with a kind of anxious uncertainty shifted into something closer to pure attention. Nobody was looking anywhere except at Elvis and at Big Mike. The band had stopped playing. The show, in any formal sense of the word, had completely paused. This was no longer a performance. This was something else, something unplanned and unscripted, happening in real time in front of 20,000 people. Elvis reached the edge of the stage and stopped there. He looked at Big Mike directly, not with anger, not with the kind of cold stare that a person uses when they are trying to intimidate someone, but directly and openly, the way a person looks at someone they are actually trying to see. There was no contempt in it. There was no performance in it. He was simply looking at this man who had been shouting insults at him in front of thousands of people, and he was looking at him like he mattered. That is not what Big Mike had expected. When a person is drunk and aggressive and shouting at someone, they are operating on a set of assumptions about how that person is going to respond. They expect anger. They expect dismissal. They expect to be ignored or removed or confronted with matching aggression. Those are the responses that fit the situation they have created. Those are the responses that make sense within the dynamic they have started. Elvis did not give him any of those responses. He stood at the edge of that stage and he spoke to Big Mike. Not over him, not around him, not to the crowd about him. He spoke directly to him. His voice was calm, and it carried across that section of the arena because the room had gone so quiet that it could. He did not reach for the microphone to amplify what he was saying into something theatrical. This was not a moment he was performing for the audience. He was having a conversation with one man, and that man happened to be standing in the middle of 20,000 people. What he said in those first moments was not aggressive, and it was not dismissive. He acknowledged Big Mike. He treated him like a person who was worth addressing. That simple fact, the fact that Elvis Presley had stopped his Las Vegas show and walked to the edge of his stage, not to have this man removed, but to actually speak to him, hit the crowd in a way that was almost physical. People who were there that night described the feeling in the room as something they had never experienced at a concert before. The silence was not the silence of boredom or confusion. It was the silence of 20,000 people holding their breath because they understood, without anyone explaining it to them, that they were watching something real, something that had not been planned and could not be repeated, something that was happening because one man made a choice that almost nobody else would have made. The security team had not moved. They were still in position, still ready, still watching the stage for a signal that had never come and was clearly not coming now. Because Elvis had already decided how this was going to go. He had not chosen to remove Big Mike from that arena. He had chosen something else entirely. Elvis was standing at the edge of that stage, and Big Mike was standing in the crowd below him. The distance between them was not large, a few feet of space. The gap between the stage and the first rows of the audience, and nothing else. No barrier of security, no wall of assistance, no carefully managed distance that performers usually keep between themselves and the crowd during a disruption. Just Elvis and Big Mike and 20,000 people watching every second of it. Elvis spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He did not match the energy that Big Mike had been putting into the room for the past several minutes. He did not come to the edge of that stage with anything to prove or any point to make. He came with something much simpler than that, and what he said in those opening moments reflected it. He asked Big Mike if he was all right. That was where he started. Not with a challenge, not with a sharp response to the insults that had been thrown at him in front of thousands of people, not with anything that acknowledged the aggression or responded to it on its own terms. He asked the man if he was all right. A plain and direct question, the kind one person asks another when they are genuinely concerned about them. The crowd heard it. And the crowd felt the weight of it immediately, because that question did something that nothing else in those tense few minutes had done. It reframed the entire situation. Big Mike had stood up as an aggressor, as a drunk man with something hostile to say, as a disruption to be managed. Elvis's question treated him as none of those things. It treated him as a person who might be struggling with something, a person whose behavior was a signal rather than simply a problem. Big Mike did not know how to respond to that right away. When a person is drunk and aggressive and they have built themselves up into a confrontational state, they are carrying a momentum that is hard to stop quickly. Big Mike had been shouting, had been loud, had been directing all of that energy outward at Elvis and at the situation around him. That kind of momentum does not just stop the moment someone asks a quiet question, but it does slow down. And that is what happened. Big Mike slowed down. He was still standing. He was still in that open space that the people around him had created. But something in him had shifted just slightly in response to Elvis's tone and Elvis's words. And the room could see it even if they could not fully explain what they were seeing. Elvis kept talking to him. He did not use the moment to lecture Big Mike about his behavior. He did not stand on that stage and speak down to him in a way that used the height advantage and the audience and the microphone to make Big Mike feel small. He left all of that alone completely. Instead, he talked to Big Mike the way a person talks to someone they have known for a while. Easy and direct, and without any of the formal distance that a performer usually keeps between himself and an audience member who has caused a problem. He was present in the conversation in a way that was genuine, and the people watching could tell the difference between that and a performance of concern. At one point, Elvis said something that several people who were there that night remembered clearly afterward. He told Big Mike that whatever was going on with him, it was all right. That he did not need to carry it alone. That the anger he was feeling had to be coming from somewhere, and that somewhere was probably a harder place than the people around him realized. He said it simply, without making a speech out of it, without turning it into a moment designed for the crowd. But the crowd heard it anyway. And the crowd understood what Elvis was doing, even if they could not have put it into words in that moment. He was not addressing a drunk heckler. He was addressing a human being who was clearly not in a good place, and he was doing it with a kind of straightforward decency that had nothing to do with his fame or his position or the fact that he was standing on a stage in front of 20,000 people. He treated Big Mike with dignity. That was the thing. That was the specific thing that made this moment different from every other way it could have gone. Not sympathy exactly, not pity, but dignity. The kind of basic human respect that says, you're a person and I'm going to treat you like one regardless of what you just did or said. Big Mike stood there and received it. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, in that quiet space that Elvis had created in the middle of a packed Las Vegas arena, something began to change in the man who had stood up shouting insults just minutes before. The aggression was leaving him. Not all at once and not dramatically, but steadily and visibly. The way tension leaves a person when they finally feel that someone is actually listening to them. The posture changed, the loudness faded. The thing that had been driving Big Mike to stand up and shout in a room full of thousands of people was meeting something it had not expected to meet. And it was losing its hold on him. Something was happening to Big Mike that nobody in that arena had anticipated. The man who had stood up minutes earlier, loud and aggressive and full of something that needed to come out, was changing in front of 20,000 people. It was not a sudden shift. It did not happen in one moment or because of one thing that Elvis said. It happened the way real change happens in a person, gradually and then all at once, layer by layer until the thing that had been holding everything together simply could not hold anymore. Big Mike's posture was the first thing that changed. When he had stood up and started shouting, his body had carried all of that aggression in it. He was large and loud and physically imposing, and the combination of his size and his anger and the alcohol in his system had made him into something the people around him had instinctively moved away from. That version of Big Mike had taken up space in a specific way, the way a person does when they are trying to make themselves felt by everyone around them. That was not how he was standing now. The shoulders that had been pushed forward were dropping. The chest that had been out was settling. The physical expression of all that aggression was quietly leaving his body, and what was replacing it was something much more open and much more vulnerable. He looked smaller than he had a few minutes ago, not because anything about him had physically changed, but because the thing that had been inflating him was deflating. Elvis was still talking to him, still calm, still at the edge of that stage, still treating this moment as a conversation between two people rather than a public confrontation between a performer and a disruptive audience member. He had not moved back. He had not looked away. He had stayed in it completely, and that sustained attention was having an effect on Big Mike that was becoming visible to everyone watching. Big Mike tried to say something. He opened his mouth and started to speak, and what came out was not the loud, aggressive certainty that had characterized everything he had said up to that point. His voice had changed. It was quieter and rougher and unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the alcohol. Something had cracked open in him, and the words that were coming out now were coming from a different place than the words that had come before. He started to explain himself. Not in a coherent or organized way, because people in that state rarely explain themselves coherently, but in the broken and fragmented way that a person speaks when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have suddenly found themselves in a situation where it is coming out whether they planned it to or not. Pieces of it came through, enough for Elvis to hear, enough for the people closest to them to catch fragments of, enough to make it clear that Big Mike had not stood up that night simply because he was drunk and wanted to cause trouble. There was something underneath it. The people who were there that night and spoke about it afterward described watching Big Mike's face in those moments as one of the most striking things they witnessed. The anger that had been written all over it was gone, and what replaced it was something rawer and more honest than anger ever is. His eyes were wet. The aggression was a cover for something else entirely, and now that the cover was gone, what was underneath it was plain to see. Big Mike was not a man who came to that arena looking to humiliate Elvis Presley. He was a man who was in pain. Whatever was going on in his life at that time, whatever had built up in him to the point where it came out in a Las Vegas showroom in front of thousands of people, it was real and it was heavy and it had been looking for somewhere to go. The alcohol had loosened everything that normally kept it contained, and Elvis had become the target, not because of anything specific about Elvis, but because Big Mike needed somewhere to put it. Elvis understood that. He had understood it from the beginning, which was why he had walked to the edge of that stage instead of signaling security. He had looked at this man and seen past the surface of what was happening, past the insults and the aggression and the disruption, to something underneath that told him removal was not the answer. And he had been right, because now Big Mike was standing in the middle of 20,000 people, and the toughness was completely gone, and what was left was just a man who was struggling with something, a man who had not expected to be treated with kindness in that moment, a man who had not expected anyone to ask if he was all right or to mean it when they asked. The crowd had gone completely still. 20,000 people were watching this unfold and nobody was making a sound. Not because they had been asked to be quiet, not because anything had been announced or organized, but because what they were watching was the kind of moment that instinctively silences people. There was nothing to add to it. There was nothing that words or noise from the audience could have contributed. They were witnesses to something private happening in a public space, and they treated it accordingly. Some people in that crowd were crying, not because anything tragic had happened, but because of what they were seeing. They were seeing one man choose to treat another man with basic human decency at a moment when almost nobody would have blamed him for choosing differently. They were seeing that choice work. They were watching the proof of it standing right there in the arena, in the changed posture and the wet eyes and the broken voice of a man who had come in looking for a fight and was leaving with something he had not expected to find. Elvis stayed with him through all of it. He did not pull back when Big Mike became emotional. He did not create distance or wrap the moment up quickly to get back to the show. He gave Big Mike the time it took, however long that was, because that was what the moment required, and Elvis understood that. By the time it was over, Big Mike was not the same man who had stood up shouting, and the 20,000 people who had watched every second of it were not quite the same either. The show continued after that moment. Elvis walked back to the center of the stage, the band picked up, and the performance resumed. On the surface, it looked like things had returned to normal. The music was playing again, the crowd was responding again, and the evening moved forward the way it was supposed to. But anyone who had been in that arena knew that something had shifted in that room that could not be shifted back. The show that continued after Big Mike sat down was not quite the same show that had been running before he stood up. The crowd carried what they had witnessed with them for the rest of the night, and Big Mike carried it much further than that. In the days and weeks that followed that November night in Las Vegas, the story began to move. The people who had been in that arena talked about what they had seen. They told the people in their lives, described the moment to friends and family, tried to put into words what it had felt like to watch Elvis walk to the edge of that stage and choose conversation over confrontation. Word of mouth was how stories traveled in 1976, and this one traveled. But the most important part of what happened after that night did not happen in the crowd. It happened in Big Mike. The people who knew Big Mike and spoke about him afterward described the man who was genuinely affected by what Elvis had done. Not in a vague or general way, not in the way a person is briefly moved by something and then returns to exactly who they were before. In a specific and lasting way. The experience of being treated with dignity at a moment when he had done nothing to deserve it, in front of 20,000 people by a man he had just publicly insulted, landed in Big Mike in a place that did not let go of him easily. He talked about it. That was one of the things people noted about him in the aftermath of that night. Big Mike was not a man who typically opened up about his inner life or spoke at length about things that affected him emotionally. But this he talked about. Not to everyone, and not in a formal or public way, but to the people close to him, he talked about what had happened in that arena and what it had meant to him. He said that he had gone into that show in a bad place. That was how he described it, a bad place. The details of what was going on in his life at that time were his own, and he did not share all of them. But the picture that came through was of a man who had been struggling. With what specifically, accounts vary, but the weight of it had been real and it had been building. And on the night of November 14th, 1976, it had come out in the worst possible way, in the worst possible setting. He had not expected what Elvis did. That was something he came back to repeatedly when he talked about it. He had expected to be removed. He had expected anger or dismissal, or at the very least, the kind of cold public handling that puts a person in their place and makes clear to everyone watching that the disruption has been dealt with. Any of those responses would have confirmed something that Big Mike, in that bad place he was in, already believed about himself and about the world. Elvis's response confirmed the opposite. The act of being seen, genuinely seen, by someone who had every reason to look away or look through him, did something to Big Mike that he struggled to fully articulate but never stopped trying to. It reached something in him that the alcohol and the anger and whatever else had been driving him that night had been covering over. It reminded him of something about himself that he had lost track of, that he was worth addressing. Not worth removing, not worth managing, worth actually talking to, worth stopping a show for, worth walking to the edge of a stage in front of 20,000 people. That realization did not fix everything in Big Mike's life overnight. Real life does not work that way, and nobody who knew him suggested that a single moment in a Las Vegas arena solved whatever he was carrying. But it changed something in the direction he was moving. It gave him something to hold on to that he had not had before that night. A reference point, a memory of being treated well at a moment when he had not treated anyone else well, and what that had felt like, and what it had shown him about what was possible. People who knew him in the years after that night described the man who was different in ways that were hard to pin down precisely, but easy to notice. Steadier, more willing to ask for help when things got hard, less likely to let whatever was building inside him reach the point where it came out in ways that hurt him or the people around him. He credited that night. Not in speeches or in any public forum, but in the private conversations where people talk about the things that actually shaped them. He came back to November 14th, 1976, and what Elvis Presley had chosen to do on that stage. He came back to the question Elvis had asked him first, whether he was all right. He came back to the way Elvis stayed in the conversation when Big Mike gave him every reason to walk away from it. He came back to the fact that he had been treated like a person, and that had been enough. Not to erase everything, not to solve everything, but enough to change the direction of something in him that needed to change direction. Enough to show him that the way forward was not through more of what had driven him to stand up in that arena. Enough to plant something in him that grew slowly, but grew steadily in the years that followed. The story of that night stayed with him for the rest of his life, and the people who knew him carried it too, because he had told them, and because what it described was not just a story about Elvis Presley being gracious in a difficult moment. It was a story about what can happen when one person decides to treat another person as worth the effort, even when the other person had given them no reason to, even when it would have been so much easier to simply look away.
There is a version of that night that could have gone very differently. Elvis could have signaled security the moment Big Mike stood up. Nobody in that arena would have blamed him. Nobody in the music industry would have questioned it. Nobody who heard the story afterward would have said he made the wrong call. A drunk and disruptive audience member in the middle of a Las Vegas show is exactly the kind of situation that security exists to handle, and using them for that purpose would have been completely reasonable and completely professional. The show would have continued, Big Mike would have been removed, the evening would have moved on, and nobody would be talking about that night 50 years later. But Elvis did not make that choice. He made a different one. And the reason he was able to make it, the reason it even occurred to him to walk to the edge of that stage and speak to Big Mike as a person rather than signal for his removal, says something important about who Elvis Presley actually was, beneath the fame and the performances and the image that the world had built around him over 2 decades. Elvis grew up with very little. That fact is easy to state and easy to move past, but it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is connected to what happened in that arena in 1976. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in January 1935, in a 2-room house that his father had built. His family had almost nothing in the material sense. They moved when he was 13 to Memphis, Tennessee, looking for something better. And even in Memphis, the circumstances were modest. He knew what it felt like to be on the outside of things. He knew what it felt like to be the person that other people looked past or looked through. That knowledge never left him. The people who were closest to Elvis over the years, the ones who traveled with him and worked alongside him and saw him in the private moments that the public never had access to, consistently described the man who paid attention to people that most people in his position would not have noticed. Staff at hotels, workers at venues, people on the edges of whatever room he was in. He noticed them and he treated them like they were worth noticing. Not as a performance of humility, but because that was genuinely how he moved through the world. He had done it his entire career. There were stories from every decade of his public life that followed the same basic pattern. Elvis encountering someone who was struggling or overlooked or in a difficult moment, and choosing to stop and be present with that person in a way that cost him something, time or privacy or the comfort of simply moving on. The private hospital visits, the quiet financial help given to people he barely knew, the moments where he pulled someone aside and asked them directly if they were all right. November 14th, 1976 was not an exception to who Elvis was. It was an expression of it. What made that night visible was the scale of it. 20,000 witnesses, a packed arena, a moment that could not be kept private because it happened in front of everyone. But the impulse that drove Elvis to the edge of that stage was the same impulse that had driven him to do quieter versions of the same thing throughout his life. He saw a person in pain, and he moved toward them instead of away from them. That is not a small thing. It is actually a very difficult thing, and it becomes more difficult the more you have to lose by doing it. Elvis in 1976 was one of the most famous people on the planet. He was performing in Las Vegas in front of a sold-out crowd. He had an image to protect, a show to run, a room full of thousands of people watching his every move. The easiest and safest and professionally defensible thing he could have done was exactly what everyone expected him to do. He chose something harder.
He chose to be human in a moment when being a performer would have been so much simpler. He chose to treat Big Mike's pain as something worth addressing rather than something worth managing. He chose to ask a question when delivering a verdict would have been faster and cleaner and far less complicated. And that choice, made in a few seconds on a stage in Las Vegas, rippled outwards in ways that Elvis never fully knew about. Big Mike carried it for the rest of his life. The people in that arena carried it. The people they told carried it in their own way. A moment that lasted maybe 10 minutes became something that people returned to for decades, not because it was dramatic or spectacular, but because it was true. It showed people something they needed to see. That fame does not have to make a person hard. That power does not have to make a person distant. That it is possible to stand at the top of everything in front of 20,000 people with every reason in the world to protect yourself and your image and your evening, and still choose to see the one person in the room who needed to be seen. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, less than a year after that night in Las Vegas. He was 42 years old, and the last years of his life had been difficult in ways that were well documented and widely known. He had struggled. He had not been well. The private reality of those final years was far harder than the public performances suggested. But he had still shown up to that stage on November 14, 1976. He had still walked to the edge of it. He had still asked Big Mike if he was all right. A man who was carrying his own weight, his own pain, his own private struggles that the 20,000 people in that arena knew nothing about, had looked at another man who was carrying his, and had chosen connection over distance, decency over dismissal, presence over performance. That is what that night tells us about Elvis. Not the voice, not the performances, not the records or the movies or the cultural phenomenon that his name became. Those things are real, and they matter. But what that moment in Las Vegas tells us is something quieter and more lasting than any of that. It tells us that underneath everything else, he was someone who still knew how to see a person. And on the nights when it mattered most, he chose to.